Hello guys, today we are going to take a look at the final of the EU Master Spring main event. It was LDLC versus K1ck Neosurf. All three games, LDLC was playing on blue side and K1ck Neosurf was playing on the red side. As you might have seen, all of Twitter was supporting the AD carry of K1ck Neosurf, Pookie style, and a lot of people and teams changed their profile picture into a photo of Pookie. It was very nice to see the community support an AD carry player and have so many people rally up behind their cause. Besides that, this was a very interesting best of 5 with a very unusual pick by LDLC in the third game. So let's get right into it and start with the drafts. In the first game, LDLC, they had a very standard opening, you could say. They banned out the Thresh. Of course, Thresh is a very versatile champion. Thresh, as a champion, has many modes. He can play an engage style champion. He can hook people. He can flay people. He can also peel very well for his AD carry. He has the lantern and the flay as well. And he can sort of disengage when the enemy wants to hard engage on your team with his ultimate. And LDLC's second ban was the Ornn. Of course, we see Ornn being banned a lot, and even though the champion was nerfed many times, I do still believe that Ornn is one of the best champions to pick, regardless of what your team is trying to do. Ornn just provides so much utility, so much late game scaling, so much CC, and besides that, he's also a very good 1v1 champion who still has an incredible amount of damage. Ornn shouldn't be doing that much damage as he is building full tank. And LDLC's last ban was the Aphelios. It of course shows that they don't want to prioritize Aphelios, but they also don't want to be playing against it. To me, it's a little bit of a mixed signal. If you think that I get that you ban either the Ornn or the Aphelios if you're not comfortable trading one champion for the other, but I wouldn't understand why you would ban both champions on the same team, especially not if you are planning on first picking the LeBlanc at B1. Then K1ck Neosurf, they banned away the Varus, so already early on in the draft they take away another strong AD carry that's similar to Thresh, as in Varus also has many modes, or at least two. He can go the attack speed build and he can go the lethality poke style build. Neosurf also takes away the Graves. Of course, Graves is an incredibly strong champion. The Graves is being seen a lot more in professional play, also in solo queue. The champion is just overall incredibly strong and is being played a lot, and we can see that Graves can have a massive impact in the games that people play. Then as a third ban, Neosurf took away the Zoe. Zoe is similar to Varus, as not as in that she has many different modes that she can take, but she is a very heavy poke style champion who also has an incredible amount of damage, similar to if you would have a late game Varus with a lot of lethality items. And I do understand why you would take that away from LDLC, just because Zoe is, as a champion, she has a certain playstyle, and the best way to counter what Zoe is trying to do is to pick hard engage and to force engages onto the enemy team. And of course, with Ornn taken away on the side of LDLC, that leaves open a pretty good spot for a B1 Zoe pick. But then LDLC opened with a B1 LeBlanc pick. LeBlanc was of course a very early game centered pick. She can have a lot of priority in laning phase. This doesn't mean that she doesn't skill into the late game. She still is a massive threat once she has 4, 5, even 6 items. But it does already show that LDLC is trying to go for a more pick style composition, just because LeBlanc has a lot of burst damage and less sustained damage, and of course sustained damage is better when you want to go for a heavy team fighting composition. Neosurf, on the other hand, responded with an R1, R2 Lee Sin and Misfortune pick. I don't fully understand the Lee Sin pick. Lee Sin is a champion that has been played in the EU Masters very often, but as a champion in itself, it's very strong. Of course, in the early game, has a very strong power spike at level 6, but at later stages of the game, Lee Sin just falls off incredibly hard. The only useful thing about the champion is that he can peel for your backline by kicking away one target, but that is all reliable on whether your opponents are gonna pick a heavy engaged champion that actually wants to reach the backline and is also melee or very short range, so that you give Lee Sin a target to kick away. But it does, of course, give them a lot of agency in the early game. And then the second pick, Misfortune. Of course, Misfortune being the, say, strongest remaining meta AD carry, with Aphelios and Varus being taken away. I thought it was quite interesting to see that none of the teams actually picked up Senna. Senna was, of course, nerfed a couple of times and there's less soul gains, but I do still think that if you want to play a more heavy team style focused composition with a good front to back team composition, that Senna is still a very useful champion to pick up. And one of the added benefits of a Senna is that you can have a lot of skirmishes around the map, especially after she's hit level 6, and then she can assist your team while just being in the bot lane. LDLC then responds with a B2 Trundle pick and a B3 Ezreal pick. I'd say that, of course, with the Varus and the Aphelios being taken away, Ezreal is just a very safe champion to pick into the Misfortune. Misfortune does, of course, have a lot of pressure in the laning phase against the Ezreal, but Ezreal as a champion has a lot of safety, so that he shouldn't be in any massive trouble in the laning phase unless Neosurf drafts a very hard engage type or dive heavy sort of bot jungle duo with the Lee Sin. And the Trundle, of course, as a champion that I think is being played almost every single game unless he is banned. Trundle is overall very good. He also has different modes. He could go full tank. You don't see a AD or attack speed heavy Trundle, luckily, in pro play. And he could also go a more supportive build by building support items like a Zeke's Convergence or a Knight's Vow, which are, of course, very cheap items. So that means that he can get online sooner. I think that the biggest thing that Trundle has, of course, is his ultimate that makes him take away a lot of the armor and magic resist of tanks and gives them to himself. So by picking Trundle, you're dissuading the enemy team of picking a tanky frontline. Well, I do think that if you pair up a tank with a Lee Sin, that means that you're gonna have to play through mid lane or bot lane, but because LDLC has already picked up the LeBlanc on B1, that's a very hard lane for Lee Sin to gank unless the LeBlanc hardly oversteps, and you have CC in the mid lane as well. So if K1ck Neosurf would pick a tank champion, that would mean that they would be only playing through bot lane, but bot lane has already picked a very safe AD carry. So that does not give a lot of agency to Neosurf to make stuff happen in the early game. So a tank wouldn't necessarily be a great option for K1ck to pick up, just because then they would have to forfeit all of their early game just because they don't have any agency to do stuff in the earlier stages of the game. And then the Lee Sin also would be quite useless just because he doesn't get to snowball the game with the early pressure that he can provide. But then on R3, K1ck picks up the K1ck. K1ck has been seen as an answer into LeBlanc many times. The thing that struck me most, or that I remember most, is when K1ck versus LeBlanc was played in the LPL, and Doinby was actually playing the K1ck, and throughout the entire game he was out pressured by the LeBlanc just because of the sheer damage that she can provide. And K1ck with being such a heavy scaling champion, a little bit similar to Ezreal, you want to get your Manamume and your Triforce. There's not a whole lot of options for K1ck to build defensive items up until later stages of the game. So that means that LeBlanc is going to have an immense amount of pressure over the K1ck. But the good thing, of course, is for Neosurf is that they do have a champion that can, after 1 or 2 items, can sort of match the poke that Ezreal brings with the Ezreal Qs and then K1ck with his rockets. And he does provide some safety for himself, so that the support that Neosurf is going to draft can fully focus on peeling for the Misfortune, as she is a very stationary AD carry, and LDLC has an assassin and a champion with a disrupt for the Misfortune ult, or just to cut off an escape path. LDLC then bans away 2 strong top laners, of course, because Aibo is a heavy carry playing champion, so they ban away the Renekton and they ban away the Aatrox. Both are quite early to mid game focused champions, and by seeing that they want to pick up Set, you can already understand why they would ban away the Renekton, as Renekton is seen as a lane counter to the Set. But of course, with Renekton being such a strong early game champion, and Aatrox as well early to mid game, they do get heavily outscaled by the Set. And as it stands now with the LeBlanc, the Ezreal and the Trundle, a Renekton or Aatrox wouldn't have a lot of agency. They would have to literally run into the enemy team, and then realistically speaking, the only champion that would be able to hit is the Trundle, because he doesn't have any mobility spells to get away quickly from them. Neosurf then takes away the Yuumi. Yuumi, of course, because LDLC is drafted Ezreal, and Ezreal Yuumi is a very potent combination. But as we've seen in previous games, that just leaves the way open for roaming supports like Bard or Pyke. And they ban out the Maokai. Maokai being the strongest engaged top laner, as he has been played and drafted a lot, or even banned out a lot. And of course, Ornn is being taken off the table earlier in the first banning rotation of LDLC. So then for LDLC, a Maokai would be a very good option into their team comp, so they have a sort of fail-safe way to engage onto the side of Neosurf when the Ezreal poke has landed, or when LeBlanc has dashed in a couple of times to do some damage. Neosurf then picks up the Braum on R4. Braum is of course a champion that can provide a lot of safety for Misfortune, and it's also a takeaway from LDLC's side, whereas LDLC could have drafted the Braum. It's not as good if you pair it up with an Ezreal, just because Ezreal has his own Pew and his own mobility with the E, the Arcane Shift, but it would be very nice to pick a Braum, of course, into Misfortune, because you can block the bullet time, you can also block all the rockets that K1ck shoots with your Unbreakable Shield. So it's a nice takeaway, and it's a nice champion that can peel properly for the Misfortune. And of course, because LDLC still have to show their B4 and B5 pick, the Braum also negates a lot of things that LDLC would want to do if they would pick hard engage. So that wouldn't be the Maokai, but maybe a Malphite or another champion that just presses R and engages onto the enemy team. Then Braum can provide a lot of safety and a lot of peel for the Misfortune. LDLC then picks up the Bard and the Set. Bard is of course, I've talked about it before, with the Yuumi taking away, Bard is just a very heavy roaming champion. You just leave Ezreal alone in lane. He can just farm up once he has his tier, take TP back to lane once you're low, and the Bard can start making plays across the map. And by picking Misfortune and Braum together, you're not enabling yourself heavily into the bot lane to try to make stuff happen there. Braum isn't a fail-safe engage. He has to hit his Qs first or hit an ultimate, and Ezreal has a very reliable way of escaping from that. So it's also another lane that the Lee Sin can try to gank. Can try to gank a lot. Of course, it could work, but realistically speaking, the Ezreal is a safe enough champion where the Bard is free to roam around, and Ezreal can just safely farm and scale up. Set as a champion is in my opinion, sort of similar to what Trundle's trying to do and what Lee Sin is trying to do. Set has a good counter engage for your team, where Lee Sin can kick away a champion, Set can ult away a champion back into the enemy team. And I do think that Set and Trundle both are very good pickups for to dissuade Neosurf to draft a heavy engaged tank on R5. Just because if he engages, he's gonna be Trundle ulted, he's gonna be Set ulted back into the enemy team. But I do believe that picking both of them, the Trundle and the Set, is a little bit of overkill when Neosurf hasn't drafted any tanks and they have quite the safe backline. And on R5, then Neosurf responds with a Mordekaiser pick. Because it's not advisable to pick a tank into the Trundle and into the Set. And the nice thing that Mordekaiser has is that once the later stages of the game arrive, and for example there's a LeBlanc that's threatening to jump into the, say, vulnerable backline of Neosurf, that the Mordekaiser can take the LeBlanc away. He can build a Spirit Visage and still be a sort of tanky champion, and make sure that Neosurf has a nice fight and a nice engage where the Misfortune and K1ck can just free hit onto the front and back line of LDLC. And I also do think that Mordekaiser has quite the options to play into Set. Possibly get outskilled by Set eventually at later stages of the game, but it's a very I would think that it's a very even matchup for both of them. It's possibly more a skill matchup, whether they can dodge the CC abilities that either champion has. And by looking at the overall compositions that they've drafted, LDLC has a very more early to mid game focused composition. Of course, because Trundle is start off with the LeBlanc. LeBlanc, of course, has a lot of early game pressure, and especially into the K1ck. Trundle is a very mid-game heavy champion, whereas he isn't a full tank that can utilize Aftershock very well. But he does provide a lot of tanky statistics, and he also has some terrain warping. So if you combine that with a LeBlanc, it gives a lot of options to sort of move people around or try to influence the pathing that champions on the side of K1ck Neosurf want to take. Azrael is a poke type champion. Of course, he wants to poke with the Qs, and once he gets 2 items, he really gets online. So with the mid lane and bot lane pick, that probably shows that LDLC wants to play through mid lane through the LeBlanc. Stead is gonna have a very isolated matchup in the top side, just because if Trundle decides to go up top lane, then the Mordekaiser can just ult the Trundle, with the high chance that Trundle has cleared some of his jungle camps and is also a lower level than the solo laners. So then Mordekaiser has a very easy 1v1, and K1ck can make stuff happen at the rest of the map, because they know that Trundle is top lane and Set is not going to go anywhere, because he wants to get the return kill after Mordekaiser gets out of the Death Realm. And Bard is overall just a very good champion. It's together with the Trundle and the pressure that a LeBlanc can have by jumping in, it's another way to deal with the Misfortune ult, because if Misfortune ult, she's going to be stationary. If you put a Bard ult on that, you can focus all your attention on the K1ck and on the Mordekaiser, kill them off, and then have an uneven fight where you just need to focus down the Misfortune and win the team fights in that way. On the other hand, Neosurf's composition is a little bit wonky. The Lee Sin, of course, is very early game focused, but the only lane that he can sort of play through is going to be topside. Now, we've already seen that Trundle probably isn't going to play through topside, at least not after the level 6, just because Mordekaiser with his ultimate can make any 2v1 situation a 2v2 a 1v1 situation. But in the mid lane, Lee Sin doesn't have a setup to gank, and in the bot lane they also don't have a hard CC easy setup. They could, of course, pressure the Ezreal away, But then LDLC could respond with the pressure that they have in the mid lane from the LeBlanc pick. Then at later stages of the game, it's possibly just going to be a sort of a war of attrition where the K1ck is going to try to poke out LDLC, and Ezreal is of course going to try to do the same thing. And once either team has been poked out, you can have a Misfortune ulting over the backline of LDLC, or you can have a LeBlanc trying to jump in. The only sad thing that Neosurf has is that with the Braum, with the safety that the Braum provides for Misfortune, they don't have a fail-safe sort of engage. Yeah, of course the Lee Sin can kick people, but Lee Sin falls off so heavily and can get bursted quite easy at later stages of the game, where the Misfortune ult is quite easily sidestepped by the mobility or by the interruption spells on the side of LDLC. So while you have two very strong AD carries on the side of K1ck, they don't have a lot of agency to do what they want to do. The Braum is probably mainly gonna be there to just protect the Misfortune from the Ezreal Qs or the Ezreal ult, or from the LeBlanc that's trying to jump in. But of course that's easily negated with a Bard ult or with a displacement from the set. And Mordekaiser is probably going to just take away, well of course he takes away one champion with his ultimate, but he's, I think, gonna take away the LeBlanc or the Trundle, just because without a Trundle they don't really have the front line, where because with the new meta, set is going to build a Blade Rune King, and then the LeBlanc being the biggest threat onto the backline of Neosurf. But as it stands, Neosurf doesn't have a lot of agency to make plays happen, just because they don't have the setup for Lee Sin to gank in any stages of the game, and with Lee Sin falling off so hard and being outskilled by practically any champion in the game, it's gonna be a very hard game for Neosurf, just because they while they have or could potentially have a lot of pressure in the bot lane, if the Bard decides to roam a lot, if the Bard decides to stay in lane, it's a double range versus range and melee matchup, which is very unfavored for the melee champion. So the Braum is going to get poked out and there's not a lot that he can do. Of course, early game, the LeBlanc has a lot of pressure over the K1ck and can poke him out, and also eventually even has skill pressure. And top lane is just going to be a very isolated matchup. Possibly that the Lee Sin is going to try to make plays there, just because he doesn't really have any other options to go. But Seth can, of course, play very safe. And if he gets ganked by the Lee Sin and the Mordekaiser, he can survive long enough with the W, or maybe ult somebody back into his own tower, where the LeBlanc and the Trundle should be able to respond. Because Trundle's only job is going to try to shadow the Lee Sin, see what kind of plays he is trying to make, and just match them and counter gank them to provide a lot of safety for his team. Overall, though, Neosurf does outskill. I think, of course, the K1ck outskills the LeBlanc, but LeBlanc's still going to have a lot of pressure. Braum still going to be useful, and AD carry wise it's sort of similar, but I do think that a K1ck outskills harder than a Trundle outskills a Lee Sin. But as I've said before this, if you don't have the agency to make the champions work that you have, so that's mostly focused around the R1 Lee Sin pick, who's just not going to be able to do anything in the game. That also makes it a lot harder. Basically the entire game is focused around whether Misfortune or K1ck can do the damage that they want to do without being interrupted by either Trundle, Set or Bard, or being assassinated by a LeBlanc. And then Mordekaiser is going to be there to ult away the Trundle when they're trying to take Drakes, Barons, Rift Heralds or other objectives, and at later stages of the game probably going to try to take away the LeBlanc so that she has less pressure. But with the slipperiness of LeBlanc, it should also be very hard for the Mordekaiser to kill her in the Death Realm. So that would, and by taking away the Mordekaiser and the LeBlanc, then I still think that LDLC has has some more agency just because they can have a very effective front line. And they have a lot of disruption spells for the sustained damage that is coming out of K1ck with the Misfortune and the K1ck. So basically at every stage of the game, LDLC is going to be having an advantage. And that's mostly due to the Lee Sin pick, just because Lee Sin doesn't have any lane to play through. He doesn't have a lot of agency in the later stages of the games, and he doesn't provide a lot of utility for the rest of the team. So draft number 1 in that regard, even while having a LeBlanc as an early game pick, still goes to LDLC. And on to game number 2. As you can see, game number 2 bans were exactly the same. So it was Thresh, Ornn and Aphelios again on the blue side of LDLC. And it was Varus, Graves and Zoe again on the red side of Neosurf. The only thing they changed is they changed up the Graves and the Varus. LDLC again opens up with the LeBlanc pick. Similar story to the previous game. Neosurf replies again with the K1ck, saying that they're confident in the matchup and confident in the late game poke and utility that a K1ck can provide. And then also, of course, recognizing that the K1ck is going to outskill the LeBlanc. So then thinking that by outscaling, he's going to be a more useful champion in their overall team composition. And this time, Neosurf, they don't pick the AD carry on R2, but they take away the Trundle that LDLC played in game 1. So then, by picking Trundle, you're again dissuading the enemy team to pick a heavy tanky style type of champion, because the Trundle would work very well into those engage type of tanks. LDLC then again on B3 pick away the Ezreal. Apparently in the previous game, the combination of the Ezreal and the LeBlanc worked very well, just because they have a lot of safety and a lot of mobility. But this time the junglers were switched around. Neosurf has taken away the Trundle and LDLC pick up the Lee Sin. In this game, or at least as the draft stands now, Lee Sin has a lot more agency to do stuff in the early game. Just because he's paired up with a LeBlanc in the mid lane, meaning that this duo can provide a lot of control around the mid side of the map, which could then also spread towards the bot lane or top lane, possibly top lane, just because Ezreal is going to be solo bot lane, just farming, just trying to scale up and get his items. But the LeBlanc having the gap close and having the CC with the change gives a lot of agency for Lee Sin to hit his Qs, to get his damage off, and together they have a lot of burst that can provide a lot of pressure into the K1ck. And Trundle as a champion, of course, is while being good into tanks and also scaling relatively well, of course, depending on what kind of build you go, in a 2v2 matchup versus these two burst and early game type of champions, there's not a lot of agency on the side of Neosurf to make anything happen in a 2v2 matchup. Of course, K1ck has a lot of safety with his W, and he can farm safely from a long distance with his ultis. But that would just mean that LDLC is going to be taking over the early stages of the game while getting outskilled by the K1ck, but not necessarily being less useful than a K1ck can be in the composition that K1ck is going to draft. K1ck then again, they picked up the Misfortune, this time on R3, because if you pick another champion than an AD carry, then you're giving LDLC the option to ban away AD carries. They could pick a top lane champion, but as they did, you can also pick a top lane champion on R4, and you can still ban away counters if you want to do that. And then instead of banning away top lane counters, they again banned away the Yuumi for the Ezreal combo, and somehow they took away the Karma. Karma, of course, is also a very poke heavy champion, similar to Ezreal. So in lane, then you again have the double ranged combination, and especially if Karma takes Comet, you have a very poke heavy type of bot lane, and then Neosurf would have to answer with a more kill threat type of bot lane. But this does leave open the Bard to take for LDLC again. LDLC on the other hand banned away the Renekton again and the Maokai this time. Is recognizing that they don't have the best front line. This time they don't have the Trundle, who can steal away the tanky stats of an opponent's tank champion. And Lee Sin is gonna get bursted quite heavily if he's being caught by the Maokai in team fights, because the K1ck and the Misfortune do have a lot of damage, and Lee Sin is not a purely tank champion. But then on R4, Neosurf picks the Aatrox, because Aatrox while being a strong champion in the top lane, who spikes of course very hard at 1 and 2 items. The problem of picking Aatrox into a Lee Sin, LeBlanc and Ezreal is that Aatrox theoretically basically has to run into the enemy team and then do that together with the Trundle, because both of them don't have instant CC abilities, or well, because Trundle has the instant Aatrox has the instant CC with the Qs, but as a melee champion he needs to run into the enemy champions first, and LDLC has a lot of mobility. So in a way, only the mobility that LDLC already has with the LeBlanc, with the Lee Sin and with the Ezreal fully counters the Aatrox, making Aatrox just a dead weight. Then the pressure is especially on the Aatrox to try to snowball his lane and try to get ahead and try to be able to side lane, because he's not going to be able to do anything versus the 3 champions that LDLC has picked on B1, 2 and 3. LDLC then of course they pick up the Bard again. Similar story as the previous game and other games that have been played in the EU Masters, with an Ezreal and the Yuumi being taken off the table. The two most roaming heavy supports, as in Bard and Pyke, are very good options, because Ezreal has a lot of safety in lane and can just do whatever he wants. He can just play safely, can scale up under the turret farm with his Qs, while the Bard is going to rotate around the map with the LeBlanc and with the Lee Sin, with the pressure that they have and with the safety that an Ezreal has in lane. And as a final pick on B5, LDLC picks the Gangplank into the top lane, because by recognizing that the K1ck has a lot of scaling and they have a very strong 2-3 item power spike mid game as well, with the Misfortune and the Aatrox, LDLC want to give themselves some late game pressure, and also recognizing that one of the only options that the Aatrox has in this game is to split push. So they decide to pick up the Gangplank. Gangplank can of course match the split push of Aatrox very well. He does a lot more damage to turrets if he has his Triforce. He can clear the waves easily, and the biggest plus of course from a Gangplank is that he can still be useful while being on the other side of the map by using his ultimate to help in team fights and create a massive zoning tool for where Neosurf doesn't necessarily want to walk through. And on the other hand, while Gangplank doesn't necessarily like playing against the Trundle because of the pillar and the disrupt that Gangplank can't really deal with, he is a very good pick up into the Misfortune, and depending on whether K1ck is going to be mainly poking with his rockets or going to be also attacking a lot, the Gangplank barrels are a massive threat into the Misfortune, just because he's a very stationary AD carry. And if Gangplank is going to build a lot of critical strike or AD, then the barrels are going to hurt a lot, and that just gives a good option for the LeBlanc or the Lee Sin to jump in and finish off the Misfortune, and then making it an uneven fight. Neosurf then, having learned from the previous game, whereas picking safety for the Misfortune wasn't really necessary, at least in the previous game. In this game it would be, because you're versus a LeBlanc and a Gangplank, which is a big threat for such a stationary AD carry. But instead they decide to go for a more laning heavy type of champion, and also recognizing that they lack a lot of engage onto the team, onto LDLC, while LDLC doesn't have a proper tank that can face tank a lot of engages that are still up for grabs. So they draft the Nautilus. Nautilus gives Neosurf a lane to play through. Of course, they can play through the top lane as well with the Aatrox into the Gangplank, but Aatrox is gonna not Aatrox. Gangplank is gonna skill regardless. But having the Nautilus and the Trundle and the Misfortune paired up in like a 3v3 or 3v2 situation is a very strong and heavy engage combination. Of course, the Nautilus ult also works very well if you pair it up with a Misfortune ult or even a K1ck package that does a lot of damage, especially in later stages of the game. And it puts more pressure on Bard to roam, because if he roams, then K1ck has a lot of agency to try and make things happen in the bot lane, or at least zone the Ezreal away, especially after level 6. Because then if Ezreal ever oversteps, Nautilus can just press R and have a fail-safe engage and CC onto the Ezreal that he can't dodge. Then, if we look at the overall team calls, of course it's sort of similar. LDLC has drafted the LeBlanc again. They have the Ezreal and the Bard combination again, where Neosurf has the K1ck and the Misfortune again. The only difference this time being is that Neosurf has drafted a more engage heavy type support. So instead of trying to support the Misfortune, they're going forward and trying to engage on LDLC, and then pairing that up with an Aatrox that is gonna have to team fight, because you can't split push versus an Aatrox, especially you can't split push versus a Gangplank, especially after the Gangplank has completed his first 2 items. And then also pairing that up with the displacement that a Trundle has. But on the side of LDLC, they, as said before, they have a lot of mobility, and then you can even add Bard to that because of the portal. Bard can also safely save his team from the engage that K1ck Neosurf has drafted, whereas he can ult the Nautilus and the Aatrox, possibly rendering them useless. Or if Neosurf decides to engage, then the Bard can ult the backline. Of course, K1ck can jump out, but he can ult the Misfortune, because Misfortune doesn't have the agency to build any items that could counter the Bard ult with spell shields. So the Bard pickup alone on LDLC side can provide a lot of tools versus what Neosurf want to do, and the pressure is especially on Neosurf to try to get ahead in the early game to make sure that they can safely engage onto the enemy team. Because one of the things that LDLC lacks is that they don't have a tanky frontline. Of course, picking a tank frontline into a Trundle is not the best thing that you can do, just because you give Trundle a lot more tankiness, and your tank is not gonna be a tank anymore in team fights. But they don't have anyone to face tank the poke that a K1ck brings, and they also don't have a fail-safe engage. I think the biggest game plan for LDLC is going to try to poke away the enemy champions with Ezreal, with maybe a Bard Q, and with a Gangplank barrels or a Gangplank ult. And then once people on the side of Neosurf have low HP, they have a choice. They either need to reset or they need to hard engage with the Nautilus. But if they hard engage while having low HP, they're of course going to get destroyed by the LeBlanc pick. So there's a lot of pressure again on the side of K1ck Neosurf to try to make things happen before you get poked out, or before any of your carries are being hit by a Gangplank barrel. And that is only already if the Gangplank decides to group up. If the Gangplank tries to split push, he can do so at later stages of the game versus the Aatrox. And of course you have a K1ck that could join the fight easily with a package. You have a Bard that's constantly roaming around the map, and you have a Ezreal that can ult across the entire map. So there's a lot of safety for the Gangplank to try to split push. And the rest of the team on LDLC has either mobility spells, of course Ezreal as well, or have a portal and a safety tool with the Bard ultimate. So it's gonna be quite hard for Neosurf to safely engage onto the side of LDLC. And while Neosurf does have an increased amount of pressure, at least in the top side of the map, by Gangplank scaling up and the Aatrox being relatively strong in the early stages of the game, the Lee Sin can persuade a lot of ganks from the Trundle because he can do a lot of damage, and of course he also has the shield for Gangplank. Gangplank has the orange to sustain, and LDLC is gonna have more pressure in the mid lane and possibly even in the bot lane. Of course, Ezreal needs a lot of items to really feel like a champion and feel very useful, but it's again a double ranged versus ranged and melee matchup. So if the Bard decides to stay in lane, they can opt into poking out the Nautilus and rendering him useless, making him have to go base. And then you have a very good setup with the pressure that LeBlanc has with the Gangplank ultimate and with the early game strength of Lee Sin to dive a Misfortune or to pressure her off the turret and to also take early objectives like the Drakes or rotate topside and try to take the Rift Heralds. So similar to game number 1, it's even though Neosurf has the scaling champion with the K1ck, and K1ck is in a position where he could possibly free hit just because he has a frontline in the Trundle and he has 2 type of engaged champions. There is a lot of pressure on the side of LDLC, again with the LeBlanc and with the Gangplank barrels and the Bard ult to try to deny the K1ck pick. So that means that basically the entirety of the game falls onto the Misfortune to try and carry it, because there's no realistic way for the Aatrox to get onto the enemy team with the champions and the spells that they have. So then the entire game falls onto the Misfortune. But a similar story is what happened with K1ck. If you have a LeBlanc, if you have a Bard ult, if you have Gangplank barrels and a Gangplank ult, and even a Lee Sin that could flank, and without the safety of a Braum this time, the Misfortune is just going to be extremely vulnerable, possibly being alone in the backline if the K1ck packages is in. So then it's just a matter of communication on the side of LDLC, whether they are going to focus the K1ck as a heavy damage dealer or the Misfortune. So similar to game 1, this is a very hard draft to execute on the side of K1ck. They do have given themselves a lot more aggressive agency with the engage that they've drafted, but it's not except for the Nautilus ult, it's not a fail-safe engage onto the side of LDLC. And of course Bard can still provide a lot of safety when Neosurf wants to engage onto LDLC. Onto game number 3. This was a best of 3, so this is match point for LDLC. If they win this game, they win the EU Masters 2020 Spring event. Bans on the side of LDLC, they again took away the Thresh, they again took away the Ornn, but this time they decided to take away the K1ck. I don't know what happened in the second game. Maybe that they felt like the K1ck was given too much agency to free hit with the heavy focus on a engage type front line that K1ck Neosurf has, or they just wanted to switch up the drafts, not play the exact same thing 3 times in a row. Then Neosurf, they ban away the Graves again. Of course, Graves is a very strong AD carry, jungler, not AD carry. They ban away the Varus, and they ban away the Ezreal. Just because you deny LDLC the safety that an Ezreal can bring to a bot lane, where he can just farm safely when he has his tier and just scale up there while the rest of his team tries to make plays around the map. Looking at the first pick of LDLC, which was a B1 Zoe pick, the Ezreal and Varus bans are very, very strong, just because Ezreal and Varus both are poke champions. And by picking the Zoe on B1, LDLC is already going to show that they're going to try to draft a poke style composition, because Zoe doesn't have, of course she can one-shot targets and she has a lot of pick potential with the Sleepy Trouble bubble, But the main thing that she's going to be doing inside the game and in later stages of the game is similar to once she hits her level 6, is try to poke out people with the long range Qs with her ult, try to hit people from across walls. And then if you pair up a Zoe as a poke champion with an Ezreal or a Varus, you can have such an incredible amount of poke that you force the enemy champions to hard engage on you, because if you're just gonna stand there and take the poke, there's no way to sustain through it, and you're just gonna get pushed off of objectives. Neosurf then surprisingly picks up the Aphelios and Lee Sin. Of course, we all know that Aphelios is an incredibly strong, hyper-scaling, late-game AD carry monster. And in my opinion, it's also it's a very safe pick, because you know that he's gonna skill regardless. Of course, the sort of lane counter to Aphelios as in Misfortune is still up, just because Misfortune's early 2 item power spike is stronger than that Aphelios is. But once they pass the 2 item point, then the Aphelios is gonna completely take over the game. But then they pair it up with a Lee Sin. Lee Sin is of course very early game focused, so while it's good that you have some agency in the early game with the Lee Sin, he's not gonna be able to assist the Aphelios in the bot lane. First, if Aphelios has the Grafentum gun, he can hit his opponents and CC them, and then you have a nice engage for the Lee Sin. But as seeing that they've drafted a very, very, very heavy early game champion with the Lee Sin and a very, very, very late game champion with the Aphelios, this is already going to be a problem, because in later stages of the game, the only thing that the Lee Sin realistically is going to do is kick away an engaged target on the side of LDLC. And with having showed the Zoe, they're going to be going more for a pick or poke type of game plan instead of going for the hard engage onto the Aphelios. LDLC then responds with the Rek'Sai pick. Of course, Rek'Sai is similar to Lee Sin, a very early game heavy champion, and do believe that if Rek'Sai falls behind, he is going to be even more useless than the Lee Sin. But in this, in the matchup of Rek'Sai versus Lee Sin is a very good pickup, just because you can interrupt the second part of the Q of Lee Sin. So you already disable a lot of the early aggression that the Lee Sin can bring if you happen to be at the same side of the map, if you can counter gank the Lee Sin or even be there before him. And as I've said before, Misfortune as an AD carry is a very strong pickup into the Aphelios. You can bully the Aphelios out of lane. And with the Rek'Sai and the Aphelios, with the Rek'Sai and the Misfortune, it also puts a lot of pressure onto the mid bot side of the map for LDLC, because they could dive the Aphelios, they could pressure the Aphelios, they can pressure the mid lane as well. So it is a very strong bot lane combination that they've picked into what Neosurf has already shown into the Aphelios and into the Lee Sin. Of course, the only downside is once the game gets to late enough stages of the game and Aphelios has sufficient peel in what Neosurf is going to pick at the rest of the draft, and then of course I mean peel for the Zoe bubbles and Zoe Qs that are going to be flying across the map, then the Lee Sin is gonna provide a lot of safety for the Aphelios for the engage of the Rek'Sai, and could possibly also even interrupt the Misfortune with a good kick. So as it stands now, if the game goes really late, the Aphelios of course is gonna have the upper hand just because he scales so incredibly well. But then Neosurf decide to pick up the LeBlanc, take it away from LDLC's game 1 and game 2 B1 pick. I think Madislaw is quite known for playing a lot of LeBlanc and a lot of Zoe as well, so he should be very confident in the matchup. And also LeBlanc of course can easily dodge out of the Zoe trouble bubbles, can also have a lot of safety versus the Rek'Sai ganks. And as we've seen in the previous game, the Lee Sin LeBlanc duo can have a lot of pressure in the mid lane in the early game, which they can transition into other parts of the map. But looking at the mid lane duo, then it's, in my opinion, is going to be sort of even, just because the Rek'Sai is very strong into the Lee Sin, but LeBlanc can, if played properly, be very strong into the Zoe. Of course, LeBlanc does get outskilled, but she can assassinate targets where Zoe needs to be extremely fed to be able to actually one-hit somebody with her combos. Then on the second phase banned, LDLC bans away 2 top laners again, so they ban away the Aatrox again, and they ban away the Mordekaiser, both champions that K1ck drafted in game number 1 and game number 2 respectively. And K1ck Neosurf again ban away the Yuumi. Even though Ezreal was taken off the table first, I still think that Yuumi is such a strong champion, and if you pair up a Yuumi with a Misfortune, that also provides a lot of safety. And even if you pair it up with a Rek'Sai, you enable Rek'Sai more in later stages of the game, just because he can tunnel into the enemy backline and have a better chance at surviving with a Yuumi than versus if he's going solo. And they take away the Bard, probably because Yellow Star had a very nice performance on Bard the previous 2 games. Well, of course, you've seen that LDLC has already won the previous 2 games. So they take it away. While I do think that Bard is a less good pickup with the Misfortune, he can still provide a lot of setup for her. He can still ult the enemy backline, the backline of Neosurf, and then once they come out, you can have the Misfortune ult coming over with. You can have a Rek'Sai and a Zoe that can follow up engage. And of course, Aphelios is similar to Misfortune, a very stationary AD carry, not like Ezreal or Lucian, where they have mobility spells. So that is still sort of a good pickup. Neosurf then goes back to what's sort of a standard draft. They pick a heavy tank in the top lane. Of course, also because LDLC picked the Rek'Sai as a counter for the Lee Sin. There's no option, or unless you would have to put the Trundle support or top lane. But with Trundle being a jungler, you can safely pick the Maokai, because LDLC has already shown their jungle pick in the Rek'Sai. This just gives Aphelios a lot of safety, because you have a massive frontline tank that can face tank the poke that Zoe brings and sustain it a lot. You have hard engage to go onto the enemy team once the Zoe has used her ultimate. Of course, once Zoe comes back from the ult, it's very telegraphed where she's going to land. He can interrupt the Rek'Sai tunnels, and he can stop the Misfortune ult while it's channeling with the CC that he has. And then of course with the follow-up from LeBlanc, it should provide a lot of pressure. But then the interesting pick that LDLC is giving is they draft a Cho'Gath to counter the Maokai in the top lane. We haven't seen a lot of Cho'Gath. Most I've seen of it is in random YouTube videos where people play AP Cho'Gath in the mid lane, which of course is incredibly fun, but not really. You're not really tanky anymore. You need to know what you're doing. So this is just gonna be a tank Cho'Gath. Well, of course, while Cho'Gath doesn't really have a lot of easy hard CC to land, it's a skill shot. Whereas, for example, Maokai can just engage onto a champ and just hard CC them by clicking on them and using his abilities. The Cho'Gath is of course going to be a very, very, very tanky champion in later stages of the game. So you're almost forcing the Aphelios to build a Blade of the Ruined King, just because the Cho'Gath gets so much more HP while having more stacks of his ultimate. And Cho'Gath also provides more safety for the side of LDLC to get drakes and to get objectives, because of course you can't, if the levels between the junglers are even, it's very hard to outsmite a Lee Sin, just because he can take his Q, he can use the second part of his Q and then smite. But Cho'Gath sort of solved the one problem that LDLC has then with the Rek'Sai, while Rek'Sai also has the bite with the true damage. But Cho'Gath can just numb away any neutral objective that is on the map, and of course his ultimate is also very useful into the enemy team, because if people are below the threshold, you have a sort of guaranteed execute onto them. But the downside, of course, of it, well, the good thing of Cho'Gath is that he can face tank the engage from a Maokai, and he can also face tank the Lee Sin and the Aphelios. at least until Aphelios has about 4 or 5 items, so that's already very late in the game. But he doesn't have the fail-safe engage. He doesn't have the silence for if the LeBlanc might jump in and he can silence her. But that would have to mean that the Cho'Gath and the Misfortune are going to be on the same position during the team fights. And that means that the Cho'Gath can't frontline if you want to use his silence to counter the LeBlanc jumping into the backline. And to provide even more safety for their AD carry, LDLC picks up the Braum. Of course, Braum would have been a very good pickup for Neosurf if they would have picked the Braum on R4. You have the safety for the Aphelios and you can counter pick top lane on R5. But by picking top lane, you give over the Braum to the side of LDLC with a lot of safety, of course, for the Misfortune. With the shield, he can face tank a lot of damage that the Aphelios and the LeBlanc are trying to do. The only option that drafting Braum gives to Neosurf is that this game they can be the ones who play the double melee into a range type the double ranged into a ranged and melee type combo. So you have the Aphelios and the Morgana into the Braum and the Misfortune. But Braum, being a very tanky champion with his unbreakable shield, he could just face tank jump in front of Misfortune, face tank the Morgana engage for him, and then also soak up a lot of damage that the Aphelios is trying to do during their laning phase. And then if we look over at the overall team compositions, LDLC sort of has the same thing, but instead of having an Ezreal as a poke champion and the LeBlanc to finish it off, they now have the Zoe as a hard poke champion, and then possibly, if he's in range, a Cho'Gath that can finish targets off with his ultimate, otherwise a Rek'Sai that can go in, and then the safety in the backline with the Misfortune and the Braum. But on the other side, Neosurf has the incredibly hard scaling Aphelios. Also, of course, the early pressure and agency that the LeBlanc and the Lee Sin can provide. And by picking the Morgana and picking the Maokai, it provides even more safety for the Aphelios. So that means that at later stages of the game, the Lee Sin can start to play a lot more aggressive. He isn't just a kick bot trying to kick away targets from the Aphelios, just because he has a tank and a good protective support. But because LDLC picked the Rek'Sai, the Lee Sin is going to be possibly also very useless in later stages of the game, just because Rek'Sai can counter him, and also the Zoe can sleep him, the Braum can interrupt him, stun him, exhaust him, so that makes it very hard for the Lee Sin. But the LeBlanc can of course also pick off champions once they're out of position. The Maokai can soak up a lot of damage from the Zoe, from the Misfortune, and once LDLC wants to engage with the Cho'Gath running in and the Rek'Sai tunneling in, you have of course you have the Maokai that can tank all the damage, that can CC them as well, and then to follow up on that CC you have a Morgana that is enabled with her ultimate, because you have two melee champions that run into your team, giving Morgana a very good option to CC them and let Aphelios carry the game at later stages. Even though Neosurf has the Aphelios and they have a tank and they have a proper peeling support, I do think that the game plan of LDLC is slightly easier, just because Braum can block the engage from the Maokai and from the Morgana as well. And then you have a Zoe that's going to be trying to poke out the Aphelios. So unless the game goes up to 40 or even 50 minutes, then the advantage, in my opinion, goes to LDLC, just because the Cho'Gath is going to be so incredibly tanky. The engage that Neosurf has isn't very reliable into a Braum and Cho'Gath. And LDLC has more options to reach the backline of K1ck. So you have a Zoe that can, of course, out over walls and try to land bubbles onto Aphelios. Then you do have the Black Shield of the Morgana, but that would mean that Morgana can't engage for the side of Neosurf. That would mean that you only have a Maokai in the front line. And then besides that, you also have a Rek'Sai, of course, that's gonna try to tunnel and engage onto the Aphelios. But overall, this is it feels like a very even type of team composition, where on the side of LDLC you have a more poke type composition, just with the Zoe and just with the lack of hard engage that they have, because they drafted the Cho'Gath in the top lane. Cho'Gath literally also has to run at people. And even though Neosurf outskills on the side, they have more options, but they need to be very careful what they do with those options, because if the Maokai decides to engage onto the side of LDLC, the Morgana needs to make a decision whether she's going to peel for the Aphelios and giving him the black suit, or if she's going to give the black suit to the Maokai and also try to help him in his engage, leaving the Aphelios vulnerable. But otherwise, there's a high probability that your tank front line is just going to get shredded by the Misfortune and by the CC combo that LDLC has, and of course the true damage from the Cho'Gath ult. But I haven't seen a lot of Cho'Gath, so I do think that it's very hard to predict. Overall, it's a very similar way, and the champions that they drafted are trying to do very similar things. Now, I do think that the Cho'Gath, of course, he has infinite scaling with the amount of HP that he can get with the ultimate stacks, and the Zoe also outscaling the LeBlanc. But on the side of Neosurf, you have a Aphelios that's going to outscale the Misfortune. But I do think that also, similar to the first two games, this one goes to LDLC, just because they have slightly more agency in the early game. And the Cho'Gath can face tank a lot more damage than the Maokai can. The Rek'Sai counters the Lee Sin engage. Braum and Morgana are sort of similar. Braum can CC people with his ultimate with his Q. Morgana can CC people with her Q, with her ultimate. Morgana has the safety with the black shield, and Braum has the safety with the shield. And then, of course, Misfortune spikes really hard at 2 to 3 items, and Aphelios spikes similar also on 2 to 3 items, but he afterwards he outskills the Misfortune. But I do think it's going to be very hard for only an Aphelios to be able to kill a Cho'Gath, and they have less instant CC than what LDLC has, so it's going to be easier for the side of LDLC to kill the Maokai than for K1ck Neosurf and especially Aphelios to kill the Cho'Gath. And then lastly, in the mid lane, the Zoe is gonna possibly bring a lot more to the table for the side of LDLC, just because she can easily get picks from long range. She can poke very efficiently onto the Aphelios or even onto the Morgana, who's going to be very squishy as a support. And for the LeBlanc to engage onto a Zoe, Misfortune and Braum seems very hard. If Zoe decides to keep her Sleepy Trouble bubble and try to throw that onto the LeBlanc, there's not a lot of agency for her to go in and not get perma CC'd and just blown up. But possibly the biggest reason is that I do think that while the comp of Neosurf is easier to execute, you just have a front line with the Maokai and the Lee Sin, and you're all trying to peel for the Aphelios. LDLC has more options to play the game. They also have more options to shut down the Aphelios with poke, with engages, with combos, with possibly even like a flank from the Cho'Gath that's gonna just numb or ult the Aphelios. But it's a very close game, and it was nice to see a draft that is with a weird pick in the Cho'Gath, and also where it's not as easily recognizable which team is going to win solely based on the champions that they pick. So that means that the themes that the champions have, whether they're engage, poke, disengage, and also with the scaling that they have. It was very, very nice to finally see something different. Those were all the games. Unfortunately, LDLC won the third game as well. meaning that Pookie wasn't able to carry K1ck in their final or in their third game on the Aphelios. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.